Okay, so I'm Carol Schneider from the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and I'll let each of my colleagues introduce themselves, just so you know our names, and then we'll say a little bit about what we're going to do.
Hi, I'm Deb Everhart. I'm a strategic advisor at the American Council on Education.
And I'm Deb Seymour, and I'm the Chief Academic Innovation Officer at the American Council on Education. Thank you.
So we have been asked in this session to talk about work that we are each engaged in that speaks to this issue of labor market signaling and how credentials and transcripts that represent credentials might respond to all of this. And we're going to be moving back and forth between extremely low tech and somewhat higher tech. You have from me a handout which literally tells you everything I mean to say. And more than I have time to say. So I ask you to get that in your hands because I'll be referring to it. And I'm going to try to set the big picture, what we know now, what we're learning now about the kinds of, whatever your term is, proficiencies, competencies, learning outcomes, that the economy rewards, building on the kind of thing that Tony was talking about this morning. But I'm also going to be a spokesperson for the notion that we are also educating citizens and human beings. And that our framing of new ways of focusing college learning or credential-oriented learning, ways of representing that learning must speak to the multiple goals of a good education, preparing students for the work of their own lives, for careers in a volatile economy, and for their role in sustaining the future of our democracy, and a democracy that has global influence around the world. So I'm going to walk through the big picture, and then the two Debs are going to talk about some new report that will be coming out soon from ACE and how that can help us frame the questions and the work that we need to do together going forward. So let me just do a little census at this point. How many of you know almost nothing about AAC and U? Go ahead, hands up. Okay, so very, very quickly. We're a big tent association, 1,350 colleges, universities, and community colleges. 2-year, 4-year, most of the nation's most selective institutions belong. 150 of its community colleges belong, many state systems. It is the one major association that has positioned itself as a meeting ground to talk about what students need from their college education and how we change our practices, change our programs to actually support the diverse and diversely prepared students who are coming to higher education today. So everything I have to say will be coming out of that broad work and specifically out of an initiative we call LEAP, Liberal Education and America's Promise, which is our big umbrella for a lot of change efforts that we are working on with colleges, universities, faculty, leaders, and many state systems as partners. So the premise that I want to put before you today is that our college credentials should show that students possess the preparation and the demonstrated achievement to persuade others that they're ready to work after college on open-ended problems and significant projects. And I want to say that again. There's much to be said about showing the competencies, the proficiencies that students have as a result of their learning, but even more important, we need to make sure that they have been able to apply their learning, the knowledge, the skill, the judgment, the responsibility, to real problems, real questions of the kind that they're already experiencing in their lives, that we are experiencing as a globally engaged democracy, and that the workplace expects from them too. And these are ideas, as I'll try to persuade you, that are firmly supported by employers, but they're also ideas that are grounded in the conscientious work of faculty members around the country at all kinds of institutions, asking and answering our question, in a changing world, what kind of learning do students actually need? So I like to use the term unscripted. We're preparing students to work on unscripted problems in their lives and their careers, and they learn to do this by practicing work on unscripted problems repeatedly across the educational experience. So big context for this is, of course, the changing economy. And on page 1 of this, I do have copies for you guys. Page 1 of this, I've given you a picture that many of you have already seen of the expanding demand in the labor economy over 50 years for people who can deal with new information and open-ended problems, and the declining demand for people who can deal with well-structured problems to which we already know the right answer. And at the bottom of this page, I've shown you some of the things that we've gleaned from our work with employers. There's a handout for this session, those of you who are just coming in, and you're going to have trouble following me if you don't have it in your hands. So we have repeatedly surveyed employers. They are advisors to our work on LEAP, and they have given us their own description of the economy and the workplace as they see it, characterized by change, characterized by innovation. Therefore, they are looking for people who have the preparation, the skills, the experiences to actually thrive in this volatile, fast-changing environment. Again and again, in a million different ways, you can go on our website and find all of this, employers have said to us, we do not want people who only have a subdivision of technical skills. We definitely want strong technical skills, and we want the broad learning as well. They like to use the phrase, a T-shaped graduate. Someone who has technical capacities, but someone who can situate those technical capacities in the work we need to do in our enterprise, whatever it is, and in our in the communities that we serve with the products and services we develop. Similarly, our democracy is deeply in need of people who can solve problems. I love to go back to a document that ACE had a lot to do with in 1947, 3 principal goals of higher education, and the third was to provide our society with people who had the trained intelligence and the social imagination to solve important public problems. So just as employers want people who can help them solve problems in the workplace, our democracy needs people, has always needed people, and certainly needs people now, who can solve problems together. So problem solving and preparation to engage in problem analysis, problem effort, and problem solutions is what I'm talking about. AAC&U has captured, through the LEAP initiative, all of this in a set of essential learning outcomes that are interchangeable with the Lumina Foundation's degree qualifications profile, if you're familiar with that document. Both of them say what I've just said, that we're preparing people for the economy, we're preparing people for civic life, we're preparing people to deal with complexity, and we need to make sure that our paths are well organized for that to happen. 2 more points of the framework for LEAP, if you're not familiar with it, is on the next page, page 3. I won't go through it, but you can read it for yourselves. And on page 4, I've given you an overview of the latest frontier of our LEAP work. We're very data-minded. We've been taking a look at how many students are actually doing, as a degree requirement, the kind of complex project that employers want them to do in the workplace. Anybody want to guess how many students are actually doing some kind of a culminating project, capstone work? 2%, 15%. Do I have other bids? 20. Anybody reading their NESE data? In 2014, NESE reported that 46% of graduating seniors had done something they identified as culminating work. Now, what that something was remains to be investigated, but they were given a generous definition. It could be private projects, it could be research, it could be a community-based work, it could be a portfolio. So in that zone, 46% of graduating seniors said they were doing some kind of culminating work. And for us, this is a foundation on which to build. If we want to make sure that students are working on complex projects, ready to work on complex projects, they should be told that as a requirement of graduation, both at the associate level and at the BA level, they are expected to do a significant project that shows that they have the skills, they have the knowledge, they have the self-direction, they're ready to take charge of significant learning. So the LEAP challenge spells all this out on page 4. And now I come to the sort of evidentiary basis behind all of this. As I say, we have done a lot of work with employers. We've commissioned a set of surveys of what employers think. We read everyone else's surveys of what employers think. And we have discovered a high degree of convergence across employers. And I don't just mean CEOs. These are C-suite employers who are in a position to influence hiring, but not just people from diverse kinds of organizations, including not-for-profits. And overwhelmingly, they want, as you'll see on page 5, they want people who have broad knowledge of what's going on around them in the world, a long list of intellectual skills, which in this economy are practical skills. They want to know that graduates have some ethical sense of responsibility. And I can tell you, we've done 5 surveys. The first of them was before the international meltdown in the financial markets. At that point, 53% of employers thought ethics should be important. It soared. It soared after 2008 and has gone up, 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 and stayed there, as it should, as it absolutely should. We want to make sure not just that people can do things, but that they are thinking hard about whether these are the right things to do. And overwhelmingly, employers have told us that they don't want to know just that students understand things conceptually. They want to know that they can apply their learning, that they have real-world experience, that they've been prepared before they hit the workplace with that real-world experience. And of course, we know that lots of learners today do have that real-world experience. They're working while learning, and we still have a long way to go in capturing what it is that they are learning on the job and weaving it back into their degrees. We've also repeatedly surveyed our members who helped us develop the essential learning outcomes you saw before. And in 2009, 2015, just came out a couple of months ago, our members reported to us in a representative survey, reflective of higher education generally, the learning outcomes that they have as requirements for all their students to earn a degree. These are 2-year institutions as well as 4-year institutions. And what is stunning to me about this page 6 is the stability. That the learning outcomes people said were important in 2009 are the learning outcomes they're saying are important in 2015. The only one that really changed was the uptick in research skills. Research skills. 75% of our members say that they want undergraduates to develop. And what is a research skill? It's the ability to use evidence in analyzing a problem. One of the most critical skills you could possibly have in a complex world. Employers value it, educators do as well. So these are the learning outcomes that the labor market and the educational market and our democracy together are signaling that students need more of. The form of the employer questions is usually, as higher education should place more, less, or the same emphasis on these outcomes, and overwhelmingly, the ones that I put in front of you, they want more emphasis on these. In a couple of minutes, we'll see why. So it's, the outcomes are one thing. The means that help students actually develop these outcomes are critically important. And here we have taken a large number of educational reform movements that are captured on page 7 and listed them together. The evidence supports this title. These are high-impact practices. The more students do these kinds of practices, the more they're likely to stay in school and the more they learn, in a nutshell. And I'll come back to the evidence on that in a minute. But what characterizes these practices? Undergraduate research, internships, service learning, learning communities, they all have in common that they require effortful work from the student. A writing-intensive course, collaborative work, undergraduate research, service learning, in all cases, the student is having to think through a complex problem and come to some, hopefully grounded, conclusions of their own about their problem. Ideally with feedback from mentors, from often working with peers, community partners, but the point is these practices work because they give students rehearsals of the kind of complexity they're going to be dealing with in the workplace and in their own lives. And indeed, employers overwhelmingly would like us to have students more reliably doing these kinds of practices. So on the next page, you see the answers to several questions that were asked in the last survey done for us, which was released in early 2015. And again, all of these surveys are right up. You can find them from the front page of our website. Look for liberal learning research, and they're all there. But in this case, we asked 3 sets of questions. One had to do with whether or not a student was more likely to be hired if they'd had specific high-impact practices. And you see on this page that, unsurprisingly, more likely to be hired with an internship. But 87% say they're more likely to be hired if they've done a senior project. That shows that they can use evidence to solve problems. Writing-intensive courses, community-based works, collaborative research, all practices that give students a head up in the labor market, and I would add, in their own lives. We also asked employers whether such practices should actually be required, and 60% said yes. So employers would be on board with higher education if we made that move. And I wanted you to see some of the other evidence on these high impact practices, because I think it's really crucial that we understand how and when they work best. Right now we have a lot of institutions saying, well, you know, we have available high impact practices, all these kinds, students may take them. Very few require any of them. Only 23% of our members require a senior project, for example. Yet 46% of students are doing them, which tells us the departments are requiring them, not the institution. But the real payoff comes, both for completion and for learning, when students have had multiple experiences of high impact practices. And I laid some of that work out before you on page 9 and 10. A set of questions that were done in 3 states, big state systems, using NESI data. The payoff comes on scales of deep learning, on scales of perceived practical and general knowledge, and on likelihood of actually graduating when students have had 5 or 6 high-impact practices, not 1. And so overwhelmingly, the insight we draw from this is that we need to be staging these engaged learning practices in an organized way across the educational experience, that we can't leave it to students to find their way to them. We need to make sure that students are unavoidably being asked to engage in working with complexity, working with problem solving. Now, again, a little question, what's the range of typical experience of high impact practices as NESI reports it? See how well you're reading my handout, it's on my handout. The average student, the mean is 1.3. And 15% of students graduate from college having done no of the high-impact practices that NESI is looking into. And George Koo has said, looking at this NESI data, we ought to make it a goal to have at least 2 high-impact practices for each of our students. Now, I'm just going to guess that given the work you do and the room you're in, that all of you had a pretty good education, and probably, like me, had high-impact practices every semester, maybe every course, not 1 or 2 between first and final year of college. So the argument I'm bringing to you, that as we think about what these credentials should reflect, they should reflect a more organized experience of dealing with complexity multiple times across the multiple years of college. And why is that? Because, in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that even though we have consensus on the one hand among educators and between educators and employers on the learning outcomes that are needed and practices that would help students get there, there is also overwhelming evidence that the majority of students are leaving college without the skill set that they need, either for the economy or for democracy or for the complexity of their own lives. So first data point here is on page 11. This is from the 2015 survey. We asked employers to rate how many of recent graduates, how many of them thought recent graduates were on the whole well prepared with a set of learning outcomes they valued. And you will see that the high number is 37%, and it goes down to, I believe, 18% or 15%. This replicates an earlier study also done for us in 2008, where we asked employers to grade our graduates on the outcomes that they had just said were important. So as a lot of people will say, well, employers complain, they're never satisfied, and what do they know anyway? Educators will say that. On the next page, we have synthesized for you from a report that we did looking at all kinds of data in 2012, showing how students do on the broad learning, the intellectual skills, the personal social responsibility, and the integrative and applied learning. And it's a dismal picture. I'll let you look at it for yourself, but let me call your attention to 2 items that are arrowed. This is from ETS using a standardized test of critical thinking and suggesting that only 8% of college seniors they have tested are proficient in critical thinking. Now, as those of you know who higher education know, 91% of faculty say, I teach critical thinking in my course, which is to say it hopefully has been rehearsed many times, but apparently not well enough. So ETS, 8%. And then for communication skills, 9% are proficient in communication skills, meaning the highest level on ETS's test. Recently, AAC&U has been involved in a big study, which is Jason Palmer in the room? Yes, thank you. Thanks to Gates, we've been able to work with, it was 9 states, now it's 12 states. Public institutions, 2-year institutions, 4-year institutions in each of these states, using students' own work produced for the curriculum as the evidence of their achievement on these critical learning outcomes. And call your attention to the score for seniors at the bottom of page 14, right-hand bottom column. What percentage of seniors are said to be level 4, the top level, in critical thinking? Just a reading assignment. What percentage of them are level 4 in critical thinking? 7.9%, which looks a lot like 8% to me. So two entirely different kinds of metrics, one using a standardized curriculum neutral test and one using students' actual work from the curriculum assessed by teams of faculty members who are trained to use value rubrics describing what critical thinking looks like. We see pretty much the same finding. And it's what employers are telling us, that students are not leaving college with those analytical inquiry skills that they really need for every possible thing they're going to do in their lives. It's better on communication. If you look at this, the other communication page, you'll see that 20% of our seniors are competent on communication according to their own work, which is twice as good as ETS is telling us, but surely not good enough. On the other hand, if you dig deeper into this, you'll see that the scores for community college students are much higher than you might have expected. If you take 2 to be the desirable level for community college students, you'll see a significant chunk of community college students are overperforming expectations for their level in the curriculum. We're still disaggregating that data and trying to understand who's over-succeeding in community colleges. But the point is, we can't just represent what our students are getting out of college, and this is no time to unbundle their credentials on the grounds that they don't need most of it. They need critical thinking skills, they need problem-solving skills, they need communication skills, and they are not getting what they need from the educational experience they're having now by overwhelming numbers. So, as we think about what our credentials should signal, we really need to organize our work so that they are driving reform, not just reporting how students are doing, because once we make visible how students are doing, it will not be a pretty picture. So my final suggestion on page 1 of this handout is that the transcript should minimally include a series of highly engaged, active learning practices that students have done across the educational experience. What are the projects? What are the portfolios? What's the collaborative research? What's the experiential learning in the workplace? What are the things they have actually done to build their capacity? Secondly, what was their capstone project? And again, I'm talking about 2-year college students as well as 4-year college students. What project did they do that pulled it all together and showed us and them that they can apply their learning? And then thirdly, what did these activities show us? Because when students are doing work, when they're doing projects, when they're doing writing, when they're doing portfolios, the work is there to be assessed and the rubrics exist to assess it. So what do we want to claim about each student's achievement of the learning outcomes they actually need for success in the economy? And what was the basis for that claim? What was the basis? And the fact of the matter is that most of higher education cannot tell you now. They can tell you how the institution is doing on certain learning outcomes, but they can't tell you how Susie is doing on certain learning outcomes. And one of the key points we made when we wrote the degree qualifications profile was that programs should be clear about the proficiencies they were helping students to develop. Students should have an opportunity to say, I understand what I'm doing here, why it matters. I'm putting together a pathway that actually leads me to this kind of learning. And at the end, we should be able to sign off that, in fact, each student has experienced the kind of learning they need for the economy, for democracy, for their own lives. Thank you.
So I was not wireless mic'd, unfortunately, and it was my intent to stand at the podium. And so I think my colleague... If you can hold on 1 second.
Deb, is it true you did offer that 1947 study?
6 volumes, those are the good old days.
So I think I'm just going to hold this. Can everybody hear? It's just easier than attaching it to myself at this point in time. We do have a slide presentation, and if at any time I become inaudible or if there's a problem with the fact that I'm holding this wireless mic, please do let me know. But in any event, I think for now it's working. This part of the workshop is based on research that has been done recently through the American Council on Education with the generous support, once again, of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you again to Jason Palmer at the back of the room and others from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation who have helped to support our work. The primary author on the 2 papers that will be released next week, of which you are about to receive a little bit of a preview, is Deb Everhart, our strategic advisor, who is sitting to my left next to Carol. And the work was done through the center that I lead at the American Council on Education. And that center is the Center for Education Attainment and Innovation. So this is a little bit about the work that we do at the Center for Education Attainment and Innovation before we talk a little bit more about this particular project. And what you can see is that these are some of the goals for the center that we try to live up to on a very regular basis with all of the work that we do. And the work that will be discussed today does fit into this kind of a mission. So part of the goal is to lead the national movement to recognize and promote higher education programs and initiatives that support post-secondary access and success. So as you can see from our title, we're about education attainment and innovation. And the education attainment portion relates partially to students who come from underserved populations and have challenges in achieving degrees. But recently we've changed the mission of the center to represent all students. And that includes students who are pre-collegiate, who probably in the past would have had no opportunity to enter into a college system to achieve a degree, and adult learners, obviously, who have particular challenges in achieving a degree, whether it's an associate bachelor's or other type of degree. And we are further expanding the definition at this point to include all of those who would like to achieve a credential that is not necessarily a full degree, but will lead to a more rewarding life in the ways that Carol has just described. Another part of our mission is innovations with measurable results, supporting diverse paths to credential completion. So we do all kinds of work around innovations that help with credential completion, whether it is, degree completion or the completion of other credentials, certifications, and so forth that may help people to achieve their career goals, their educational aspirations, and again, to lead productive and healthy, happy lives. Helping decision makers understand the forces driving change. We are in an environment where there are a lot of policy folks. Our government relations team is probably the team that is the team for which ACE is most well known. And we are in constant communication with our research and policy folks about ideas around education attainment and the innovations that are occurring in that space. Evaluation of workforce and military training through ACE credit recommendation services. Many of the people in this room probably are familiar with the 70-year-long history of evaluating military training for credit recommendations and the 50-year-long history we have of evaluating workforce training for credit recommendations for institutions. And most recently, and this was once again funded by the Gates Foundation, creating an ecosystem with the Alternative Credit Project. And I'm not going to spend time here, since this is a short session, going into all the details around that particular project, but the work about which you are about to hear does relate, or I should say stems from that project and was funded by that project. So this is the work that we're about to introduce. And it is an analysis of the evolving uses of credentials and competencies. So when we talk about competencies, we typically just talk about competencies in the context of CBE or competency-based education. This work takes a slightly different approach to looking at competencies, and it's not just about competency-based education. It's a more comprehensive approach that looks at competencies in the context of what kinds of things students should know and be able to do no matter what kind of degree they achieve while they're in an institution, whether it's been labeled a CBE degree or not. This is, as I mentioned, part of the Alternative Credit Project that was sponsored by the Gates Foundation. There are 2 white papers that are being issued next week, Thursday. One of them is Quality Dimensions for Connected Credentials. The other one is Communicating the Value of Competencies, and these are interrelated works. One is more focused on quality dimensions around credentials. The other one is a little more focused on research that we've done around competencies and what employers value in terms of the competency set of a college graduate. So as you can see in these bullets, these are about how employers value and assess student competencies, how educational institutions can improve their credentials and clearly articulate competencies, and quality dimensions that support connected credentials. And there's a lot of detail in the papers around these issues. We will just give you a little bit of a broad overview today and perhaps tease you to attend our next Thursday's event, either in person here in Washington, D.C. at ACE's offices, or virtually. There is a virtual possibility, and you can still register for that one as well. Here are the details on that event. It's Thursday, February 25th, 9:30 to 11:30 a.m. Eastern. It's possible to join either in person or online. This will be the release of the white papers, and there will be a panel discussion featuring the people listed, as you can see on the screen. So I'll give you a second to look at that, and then I'm going to turn over the rest of this presentation to my colleague, Deb Everhart, who was our strategic advisor in this work and oversaw a lot of the thinking and the strategy that went into both of the white papers. Thank you.
Thanks, Deb. How's that? Is that okay? So what I'm going to do, is that too loud? It sounds too loud to me. Is it okay back there? Okay. Is give you a sneak peek into what's in the white papers that are going to be released next Thursday, but also very directly tie this into the work that AAC&U has done that's so important in terms of grounding a lot of our research. These 2 white papers are thought leadership. So they're designed to help higher ed leaders and decision makers really wrap their heads around these issues and figure out how they would approach change, which we know is a difficult thing to do. And so some institutions might be approaching this change because they already have a LEAP initiative, and there's really good resources for institutions to collaborate on those. And so they might come to these white papers to use them for dialogue around topics of competencies and connected credentials. Or they might start with the white papers and get some dialogue going and start to envision potential futures and then weave that back into high impact practices. But in any case, there are many different resources and initiatives, and we're not trying to replicate any of those. In fact, in the Quality Dimensions white paper, there's actually a section on collective action that shows how some of these initiatives are related to each other so that you can get a sense of the landscape. So one of our premises is that institutional diversity means that it's unlikely that there is going to be any monolithic or standardized approach to what competencies we're using, how they're being communicated, how they crosswalk from education to employment. We heard this morning that some things are happening in specific industries, but in general, we think there's going to be a fabric of different approaches based on the mission and goals and constituencies of different institutions. So these white papers are designed to be flexible in that regard with different perspectives and approaches. And they include grounding and context, definition of key terms, problems that stakeholders are currently encountering in our credentialing ecosystems, and importantly, challenge questions that will stimulate dialogue and help people envision potential futures. So the workshop-y part of this session is going to be a little part at the end where I'm going to put up some challenge questions that you can try out with your colleagues in the room in terms of how they stimulate dialogue. So how can we improve the communication of the value of competencies, and what does that have to do with the high impact practices? So we know that a lot of the big picture concerns that we're talking about today, they really play out in the individual struggles of students, right? They don't really have the tools they need to be able to articulate their own competencies and figure out how they can help them with that transition from education to employment. And so employers, on the flip side, also don't know what's included in credentials. They're primarily making assumptions about the competencies of students who have those credentials. So if we have better transparency, if we have better definition of credentials and the competencies within them, but also importantly, if we can empower the programs, the students, the faculty to really have a shared understanding of what those competencies are and how they can be articulated, we can really improve that whole ecosystem. So one big section of the competencies white paper is focused on these three perspectives and how they're also woven together in terms of how student support staff and the students themselves can, at the level of their specific learning achievements, have improved communication of the value of their competencies, how administrators and registrars can do that at the level of administrative processes and credentials, and how academic leaders and faculty can do that at the level of academic programs and curriculum. So this is specifically where the high impact practices come in. So if you take, for example, writing intensive courses or writing intensive learning activities in general, clearly these are helping students develop those written communication competencies, but they're also probably helping students develop critical thinking, inquiry and analysis, and reading competencies. So this translates into communicating the value of competencies because it helps students to effectively articulate their own strengths, and that will improve their likelihood of getting jobs that are a good match with those strengths. They need context to understand these competencies, and so if the competencies are explicitly included and described to them in the courses and programs, then they can have a framework for understanding what they're achieving in those courses rather than just passing the courses and completing the degree. So if they don't understand that, they're not likely to be able to articulate the value not only of the courses, but also of the specific learning artifacts and this writing that they're producing in those courses. So many different types of learning artifacts, not only the written work, but also team collaboration, lab experiments, and other common academic assignments. These can all yield useful evidence of competence mastery. And so the more they understand the alignment of the competencies to the learning activities and their own evidence of learning, the more effectively they can curate that evidence and apply it to their goals, both in their educational context and in their employment context. So the writing assignments can be designed to hone the ability to write clearly on many different topics for many different types of tasks. These are obviously workplace skills. It helps them develop a sense of audience and purpose. And audience and purpose are important in having a very practical benefit in terms of resume writing. If employers are screening applicants based on their keywords and phrases in digital resumes and cover letters, do students understand how to write those so that they reflect the competencies? If you think about, Carol talked already about capstone courses and projects, but if you think about that high impact practice in the context of communicating the value of competencies, obviously students are learning many different competencies and honing competencies to higher levels in those projects, including, importantly, integrative learning. So if students are encouraged to collect and reflect on their own evidence of learning, that could be a portfolio, a capstone project, a collection of badges, then that evidence of learning and the curation process is really valuable for them for demonstrating specific strengths to employers. So you might say, well, is that going to do any good if employers aren't requesting portfolios or other evidence of learning? In fact, employers generally aren't even requesting transcripts. If we extend the transcripts, will that make any difference? But I would argue that the fact of students having curated this evidence of learning is extremely important in and of itself, because it helps them match and articulate their competencies to job requirements. I mean, if we're talking specifically about employment, it also helps them understand those competencies in other contexts, civic and social contexts. And if they do use any of that evidence of learning, or even if they need to be able to talk about that evidence of learning, that can definitely differentiate them from other job candidates who might not have that. So this crosses over into what the institution can do, to what the institution and the registrars, for example, can do, because if students do have verified evidence of learning, it's actually verified by the institution via an extended transcript, a competency record, badges, then those things can and should be portable in terms of helping students in many different circumstances. So I think you can probably assume where this is going then in terms of other high impact practices. I'll just say a word about internships as an explicit bridge between education and employment. But in particular, all different types of internships and workplace embedded learning can and should be tied back to the competencies in the academic programs and in specific courses, so that the students and the faculty understand how the workplace learning is supporting the competencies in the academic program and vice versa. So what I'm going to do now is transition to the challenge questions, because you can say, okay, well, so these are all good ideas, but how do we get to action? And challenge questions are a good way to do that, because they are what it says. They challenge you to think about things, to think outside your own perspective, for example, and to get into a dialogue not only about, kind of drilling down into the question, but also using the question to visualize potential futures so that you and your colleagues could chart a path for how to get to that potential future state. And the white papers give a good framework for doing that on these two topics. But we could spend about 5 minutes for you to talk to someone who's sitting next to you about one or more of these challenge questions. Then we'll come back to the podium to get some of your responses in terms of how a certain challenge question sparked ideas, and also just to get some general questions. Okay? So 1:55, we'll come back to the podium.
life. If the corporations take over, we're all going to be reduced to. This is what we're going to be reduced to.
I love the title of your little essay that you're publishing.
The other question is, what's wrong with the diploma supplement? That's something your office does. It's one page, it can be done very quickly, and it's got a standard form. It's used in 29 countries. What's wrong with the diploma supplement?
I mean, it's been discussed, yeah.
That's really where I was going. I mean,
It's closer.
I say transcript, but it could be another way. I don't know what whether or not it's getting at this.
Okay, so if I can get everyone's attention again. A few minutes barely scratches the surface with this kind of questions. The fact that you're not stopping talking indicates to me that these are good challenge questions. So,
Quiet!
let me get... I skipped over my little preface that I had in my comments about challenge questions, but that preface says, you know, that you could spend months discussing these questions at your institution and years applying them. So it's kind of unfair to give you just a couple of minutes to scratch the surface, but I did want to allow some time for you to give back some insights from your discussion of the challenge questions and also questions that you have for us. Mix and match. Mix and match.
Get some feedback first.
Yes.
I want Carol to. Hi, Mike Olnick from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'd like Carol to speak to the question of, is there an underlying assumption here that the competencies, the meaning of complexity, the meaning of problem solving are the same across employment and academe? And I'm thinking that there's much more of a component in some settings of academe of understanding without the requirement of applying. So a political philosophy course, maybe you go write a constitution afterwards, but in general, there's a lot of knowing and learning that's not instrumental, and I'm wondering if people are talking across each other sometimes.
Well, what we're trying to do in our efforts is to bring different conversations together. The assumption that, and it's more than an assumption, I think the evidence suggests that when you're really thinking through a complex question, you're using evidence. And all of us know that it's something you thought you understood in your own head. As soon as you tried to write it down, you come up with all the things that you didn't know to ask about until you actually tried to do something with it. So part of what we're trying to do is to make sure students have more experiences of thinking through the complexity by doing something with it. And in our own work, we say constantly those questions can be enduring questions. It can be questions about justice, about virtue, about love or integrity, or they can be absolutely practical questions like, what am I going to do with my accounting firm next week? Students need both. It's not either or, it's both. And I think we would shortchange our world if we had only instrumental application-specific assignments for students. But at the same time, I know that we're shortchanging people when we ask them to read complex material and do nothing with it. and then they hit the job market unable to show that they can apply their learning and overwhelmed by complexity. And I've hired some of those people. So, you know, I do this as an employer who, in an earlier life, was a real academic. So.
Yes.
So we had a little bit of a discussion right here about some of the problems of measurement of certain of the skills, so particularly the softer skills, things that may be very hard skills, things like teamwork or creativity and innovation. And while recognizing that it's important to help students identify those, right, it's not very helpful if you then say you need to identify those for your employer, but you don't have convincing ways to demonstrate that you have those skills. Participation alone may not be sufficient to show you that you have those skills, right? And on the other side of it, we were concerned that many employers are barely looking at transcripts as it is, let alone are they going to be taking a deeper dive into whatever record of competencies we're now able to develop further, and how do we think about that?
Yeah, so there are certainly layers of the, you know, the search process in terms of employers weeding out. A lot of the weeding out is done by machine processes, right? Keyword searches and stuff. So if the student has a better understanding of what vocabulary to use, for example, that's a practical way to get into those other levels where the employer could be looking at other evidence. But you raise a really valid point in terms of, well, what is valid and relevant evidence? Valid from the academic perspective, but relevant from the employer and practical application perspective. And you do need to have good, authentic assessments in order to do that, and good tools like the value rubrics. And ideally, something like a rubric assessment on a learning artifact is conveyed as part of the evidence of learning. And there are technologies for doing that, so that's going to start to change things to make it easier to do that.
So if I could just quickly jump in to append to what Deb just said. One of the projects that these white papers that we're about to release represented was the question of what is authentic assessment of competencies and what does it look like. And I think the bigger question is, what is an authentic assessment of competencies that not only institutions and accreditors would buy as valid, but that employers would buy as valid also? And from my personal experience up to this point in time, and I know there are others in this room whom I'm looking at right now who can attest to this, when we ask employers that question, they very often respond, we don't know what that assessment would look like, but when we get an employee who has those qualifications, we know it when we see it, right? But we can't really guide you in what those assessments ought to look like.
The problem there is that you don't really move the needle, right? In terms of, I'm the director of the Career Center at AU. I don't actually just on the street. But what that says is that you've got to get the student into the job and have the employer trust that they're going to test it out kind of on the job, as opposed to knowing in advance somehow that there's an indicator that this student will, or this new employee will have this particular credential.
Well, I think.
We heard exactly that in an earlier session this morning.
Yeah.
From an employer.
So just to quickly respond to that, and I guess we can take one or two more questions. From both Carol's perspective, I know we're out of time. Just quickly from Carol and Deb's and my perspectives, part of what we're trying to do is close that gap. So, there's an understanding on the higher ed side that the gap of students demonstrating competencies when they achieve degrees, whatever gaps there are associated with that need to be filled. There are huge gaps on the employment side in terms of what employers think they're looking for and what they think they're actually getting in terms of job candidates. Part of the goal of most of these projects, and I'm looking at some folks from the Lumina Foundation who are in the room as well, because they're deeply involved in some of these projects as well, is closing those gaps. And this is what we're all trying to address, ultimately.
We've actually seen the needle move on this since we first began our work on this issue with employers over a decade ago. And we repeatedly asked on surveys the question, what would persuade them? So 7 or 8 years ago, employers overwhelmingly wanted to know that students had been in a supervised internship, one that was actually mentored by somebody, and they wanted to know what the evaluation was of that internship. But in recent years, and this influenced our decision to put our energy behind the LEAP challenge and students doing real projects, employers started saying this internship isn't going to be meaningful to me. They're going to be running projects in the workplace. I want to know that they've had experience doing that. And that then leads to, okay, well, have they had experiences doing a project, and what prepared them for that? And I think once you have the work of the project, whatever it is, the rubrics already exist to assess whether that project showed creativity. There's one for integrative learning, connecting experiential and academic perspectives. There's rubrics for problem solving, for teamwork. There's rubrics for engaging difficult difference. The rubrics are there. So the question is, are we mobilized as educators to use them and to show that students actually have developed and demonstrated through their hands-on work the preparation for the world that we're promising them and that they need and that they deserve?